Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name's Deborah Hatswell, and you're listening to BBR Investigations. Each week, when I sit down to write out the reports that I'm going to share with you all, I often have a reason why I choose those particular reports. There'll be a pattern to it. So, for instance, some weeks it will be Bigfoot or Dogman reports, other times it'll be UFO or paranormal cases. Or sometimes I use my time with you all to look at certain aspects of the areas where these creatures are seen, and sometimes share new cases that have come in. And I'm often sent articles from listeners and witnesses alike. I was discussing recently on one of my YouTube live streams that I believe there are many reports out there of our UK cryptids that are reported by the witnesses to UFO and paranormal groups. For all we've come a long way in the subject, there is still a long road ahead. Cryptids in the UK is not something we're taught at school. It's a niche subject. It isn't a household talking point. It's not something many folk have any knowledge or reference of. However, we British love our UFO and paranormal stuff. Over the decades, I think many sighting experiences reported in these subjects could be possible Bigfoot and wild man or dogman creatures. I was trying to pin down an example to start off the show that would make it easy for me to show you what I meant when my email pinged. And one long-term listener and witness sent me an article where a tall, hairy, broad-shouldered Boggart was seen by people in the Charlbury Road area of Nottingham. The witness wrote out their own report and sent it in to the Nottingham Hidden History team, and you'll find a link for that below. Thanks to Ollie, I can share that report with you. Now, before I read the details of the case Ollie sent across, I went to look at the area on the map to see if I could pin down the usual green flags we look for in areas of possible cryptid reports. We always look for reservoirs, railway lines, and areas that abut them are often in close proximity to a sighting place. In this case, the railway line is one street away from Charlbury Road. And then there's Woolton Hall and the Deer Park, which was once a stately home and is now open to the public, and that's just a few steps to the south. There is the reserve with stock fishing pond to the northwest corner. In fact, there are 3 country parks all sitting in an easy walk of Charlbury Road, and nestled between them is a cemetery and a golf course. When this report took place, there would have been far more rural land available, as it's now quite a built-up area. There is, however, still an ancient site within this modern bustle. The Hemlock Stone sits in Bramcote Hills Park. The stone is 8.5 metres tall and is a piece of twisted red sandstone, and it's been dated back 200 million years and was forged out of red sandstone in a desert climate during the Triassic period. Historically, the stone was used for pagan Celtic ritual and was passed by the Romans on their way to their fort at Broxtowe. The area itself, like most of Nottinghamshire, is underrun with natural caves and tunnel systems. There are over 800 caves below the city of Nottingham alone. Druids or Celtic priests used the stone as an altar to light fires the night before May Day in order to celebrate the festival of Beltane. The Hemlock Stone was specifically sacred, as it was surrounded by oak trees and a nearby blessed spring. The spring was believed to have special healing powers, and unfortunately it's been lost now, it's gone. But it was previously used by travellers and local people for its healing powers. The Hemlock Stone is also surrounded by sandy caves and hollows on Stapleford Hill, a hill that looks out over a valley. The River Trent is also a very short walk away, and the area has lots of small brooks and streams, and I have 3 cryptid reports very close to Charlbury Road that have come in over the intervening years. Let's hear the article provided by Ollie, and then we can look at the sightings in the area also. In April 2022, the blog Nottingham Hidden Histories shared a story with its readers that caught not only Ollie's attention but also my own. Back in the early days, I would scan forums and blogs for hours on end, looking for articles just like this. Could there be a possible connection between the reports that we have now and the ones that happened back then in history? Or is it something to do with the land there? And that's why we have so many strange experiences listed for such a small area. Now, the chap who wrote in is called Frank Earp, and he titled his story as A Close Encounter with the Third Kind. Frank uses the word third as the creature he saw was hairy, and he said, "This is the story of my encounter with the Boggart, although I did not know it as such at the time." In the mid-1960s, Britain was in the grip of UFO fever. Up and down the country, there were reports of lights in the sky and other unidentified objects. For several weeks, the media reported strange goings-on in the town of Warminster in Wiltshire. And Nottingham too had its fair share of UFO activity. This was a fascination to boys in his early teens, and together, me and a group of friends started a UFO club. Well, at least it kept us out of mischief, but it led to many strange adventures too. The adventure related here happened with two of my fellow club members, whom I will call W and M. One fine autumn afternoon, my friend W and I walked the mile or so up Charlbury Road to meet with fellow club member M. It was our intention to carry out what is known as a skywatch, basically looking for UFOs. From M's house, the three of us crossed Wood Yard Lane and walked along the north bank of the disused Wollerton Canal to the site of Wollerton Colliery. Here, the old slag heaps line the canal bank, and we thought it would be a good vantage point for our activity today. We spent the next couple of hours scaling and sliding down the heaps and swinging out over the canal on a rope tied to the branch of a tree, always with an eye on the sky. About 4 o'clock, as daylight gave way to twilight, we decided, as we hadn't seen any flying saucers, to head back to Em's house and perhaps just play some records. At this site, the canal opens into a wide oval basin, a former passing place for coal barges. And although the canal had been drained, the old bed was still marshy, with a small channel of water running down the centre. As we crossed the basin to the opposite south bank, we were aware of a slight ground mist, and it was starting to rise within the basin. Climbing up the wall and the bank onto the towpath, we stood watching the mist as it began to thicken. And as we watched the cloud of mist, it was almost donut-shaped, around the size of a fairground dodgem car, and it started to form, and it rose above the bed to the height of about 4 feet. The remaining body of mist, which now covered most of the basin, stayed within inches of the ground. The cloud began to sparkle with a myriad of tiny pearl-coloured lights, which blinked on and off with an incandescent glow. And at this point, I suggested this was just natural phenomena known as corpse candles, will-o'-the-wisp, that spontaneous combustion of methane gas. Suddenly, the cloud began to slowly move towards the bank, and two balls of light formed. They were the size of watermelons, around 2 and 3 feet apart. They formed at its centre in a controlled way. The cloud came to a halt on the towpath around 30 feet away from us. All around, afternoon was giving way to evening, and in the growing darkness, the spheres became more obvious. They seemed to bob up and down like corks on water. No malevolence appeared to emanate from the cloud, just curiosity. It seemed that we, as observers, were in turn being observed. However, discretion got the better of valour, and turning in unison, we walked away. After a few paces, curiosity got the better of us, and we stopped and looked back. To our horror, the cloud had followed us and was now just 20 feet away. Panic now set in, and we retreated, this time at a jogging pace. The canal now took a gentle turn, and then a straight course to a point where the old coach road once crossed via a stone bridge. The canal had long since disappeared, and the road was now carried over the canal on a high bank, with the towpath climbed on either side. I had the sudden feeling that the thing would not follow us across the road, and I voiced this fact to my friends. Frequent glances over our shoulder told us that the cloud was keeping pace behind us. In fact, it was gaining with every step. Reaching the bank, we turned to see how our pursuer was now just a few feet behind us. Seconds later, we mounted the bank and found ourselves looking down on the cloud, which had moved to the foot of the bank. It seemed that the cloud would not follow us any further than that point. So with relief, we crossed the road and descended onto the path. Now, with the bank between us, we felt safe to stand and look back. And for a few seconds, the road above was clear. And then slowly, the cloud came into view, now hovering over the road at the top of the bank, and it was looking down on us. We took off in full retreat, running in terror, the cloud still gliding effortlessly behind. And the pace we were travelling, it was not long before we reached the woodyard lane and at the end of this part of the canal. Here we turned to face our pursuer, which was now only 6 feet away, safe in the knowledge that we were just, across the lane from Em's house. With me in the middle, we stood in silence, like gunfighters, waiting for the next move. And I broke the spell. And as taking a step forward, I said, "If you are a friend, come forward." A few seconds of silence followed, and I paused for a response. With my own eyes fixed on the swaying orbs, I began to say, "And if you are an enemy," and my words were cut short, as B tapped me on the shoulder and said in my ear, "When I say run, run." My eyes followed his pointing finger to the hedge on the left, and there, only feet in front of M, silhouetted by the light of the orbs, was the black shape of a hairy figure. Around 6 feet tall, its head appeared to be directly on its shoulders, whilst its arms, which seemed to be long, tapered to a single finger, and each of these fingers curved inwards around a glowing red rod the size of a pencil. The legs seemed to disappear from around the mid-calf, and something of the mist from the clouds swirled around where the feet should have been. I had absorbed all of this information in seconds, and for in an instant B had shouted the word "run," and like an Olympic athlete he took off. I followed with the same speed, leaving M alone, calling out repeatedly, "Can you see it, lads? Can you see it?" M must have quickly realised he was alone and soon caught up to us. The other two began to blurt out their experience. I silenced them, saying that we should independently draw what we saw. It turned out that the three of us drew identical pictures of the cloud. Whilst B and I drew almost identical pictures of the figure, because his attention had been entirely on the cloud, M hadn't seen the figure. Years later, I was able to discover that our encounter had not been with some alien being. The hairy creature fitted the classic description of a class of fae known as the Boggart. He's correct. There are many Boggart reports in the UK that are 7 foot tall and completely covered in hair. The mist I've heard of before in the Wigan area, also old mining land and very similar to the land down at Woollerton. And I wonder if when the earth was disturbed down there, when the old mining happened, that enabled something to come up or emit in some way. I did some digging online and I found a report in Woollerton Hall Park that I think is well known to locals, but some of you guys might not have heard it. Now, this doesn't fit with the cryptid theory, but I wanted you to understand that there's got to be something going on this land, because the next two encounters are clearly bizarre. I found in the Fairy Folklorist blog a story of a group of children who had an amazing encounter with a set of gnomes, and the person who wrote the blog said, "Today, I visited a fairy location I've been wanting to visit for many years, the wonderful Woollerton Park in Nottingham. In 1979, a small group of children were wandering the park early one evening when, much to their surprise, they were chased by gnomes who had motor cars. Certainly not your typical fairy sighting. The children said there were around 30 cars in all, with 2 gnomes in each car. The car made no motor noise, but it did have a button and bell instead of a horn, and it had triangular-ish lights, and the gnomes leaned to steer the cars. Another child said they didn't have steering wheels, just a round thing that turned with a handle on it, and the cars could also jump over logs. What a wonderful sight! The gnomes were described by the children, and one child said it was about half the size of me, and they had long white beards with red at the bottom, and they had little white and red cars, and they were chasing us. Another child described the beards as long and black. They wore tights instead of trousers, and some were torn with yellow patches on them, and they wore blue tops with a green cap with a big bobble at the end. And the gnomes had old wrinkled faces and were friendly, and they laughed joyfully. One child said they didn't talk, another said they shouted at each other, but not in a language that he understood. One child said he could see them clearly as there was a light hanging in the trees. On this occasion, the gnomes chased the children, but one child mentions they had seen the gnomes previously on another night, but they just ran off rather than chasing him. One of the children mentions the gnomes chasing them by the gates, and the children ran out of the gates, but the gnomes didn't follow them out. And the child thought this could be because they don't come out in the light and might have died. What an interesting thought. In the transcripts, the children give the locations as the swamps, and one said they went back in the bushes. There's wire around them, like a fence, and that's where they get in. We went into the bushes when it was daytime, and we couldn't see anything, just trees and swamps. Another child mentioned the swamp as having a big fence around it, and normally you can't go in there, you have to keep out. The third transcript mentions a gnome coming out of the hole where the fence was, and the children saw gnomes coming out of the holes in the top of the trees, and the child said, we just went over the fence to look at them, and when we went closer to them, they went back to the holes. One of the children was said to have fallen into the swamp during the chase, so presumably the children entered the forbidden fenced-off area. Were the gnomes trying to get them to go into there? I mean, the story spread and spread, received media coverage, and although there seems to be no mention of the gnomes in the museum at Woollerton Hall today, the gnomes have not been forgotten by folklorists. The blog said, just recently, a great article appeared in the Nottingham Post, seeking the children who were originally there when the gnomes were sighted. The article can be found here and is well worth a read, and also includes information on other fairy sightings in the park. Now, an earlier mention of fairy folk in Woollerton Park can be found in Marjorie Johnson's Seeing Fairies, where she writes of an account given to her many years ago by Mrs. C. George, who had long ago, as the year of 1900, was passing the gates of the hall when she saw little men, dressed like policemen, standing inside the lodge entrance. They were smiling and looking very happy, and were about 2 to 3 foot tall in height, and they didn't have any wings. She also mentions that fairies had been seen dancing around the lake in the park. The book also contains an account by Jean Dixon, who became aware of the gnomes whilst walking in the park, and described them as eager to show her the scenes and objects that delighted them as she followed them around the park. Now, pardon me for interjecting with a bit of negativity here, but in each and every one of those cases, the cloud included, it would seem that the children or the people who saw them were meant to follow. Was this donut-shaped cloud with pearly or, pearlescent, was that meant to draw them in? It was clearly connected to the land because the boy said it couldn't cross that bridge. And those gnomes couldn't cross the gate. Are they tied to that land in some way? I've often said over the years that I often wonder if the names that we give to the beings we see just change with history. As the woodwose of old is seen as 7 foot tall and hairy, so is the UK wildman, and so is the Boggart in the very first depiction tonight. Is it just history that changes the names? And are they connected to the land? I noticed that oak trees are incredibly important, amongst other trees, but oak trees stand out in the Druid tradition. And also, they seem to be very important to the cryptid creatures, and that was mentioned in the article that Ollie sent over. Now, I have some reports because it would seem that the area has been a hotbed of activity for a very long time. The reports that I have came in up to 2023. So I received a report from a chap who contacted me via my Facebook page and asked what the lady who saw a creature at Flamborough Head had meant when she said, whatever that was, it seemed to be stalking us as it was flat to the floor. I would say the look in its eyes confirmed this. And he's talking about a person who saw a creature at Flamborough Head that dropped to its belly, almost Fred Flintstone-like, and crawled out of there. And he said, I've seen something very similar. Not at Flamborough Head, though, but here in Nottingham. What I saw had unusually large, oval-shaped eyes. It had its face flat against the ground. I even recognise the oddball behaviour of the animal that she talks about. When she says, the look in its eyes confirmed this, is she perhaps referring to some kind of clear, emotive expression? Because the animal that I saw was calm. It never panicked or bolted. It scowled at me like Clint Eastwood, and then it just lay back down in the darkness. And when it did that, it was like watching a reptile submerging beneath the water. That must have been absolutely terrifying, and I cannot imagine what that must have been like for either of them, to be honest. I got a report that took place in Bilborough in Nottingham, 1994, and a chap emailed me and he said, I wanted to contact you, Deborah, as I've carried this with me for decades, and whenever I've tried to share it, I'm not believed. It happened close to the Harvey Haddon Stadium in Bilborough, Nottingham. The area has changed a lot over the years as it's been built on now, but at the time, it was all open fields. Nice place to be. Well, it all happened about 24 years ago now. I live in Nottingham and I'm a very open minded person. Back then, I was going out with a girl and I always walked her home at night, going the same way, every time. We'd walk through a path and then we always walked down a long cut through. We did the same walk every time, never had any problems until one night. I'd walked her home and I was returning to my home for the night. I'm not the sort of person who scares easily, but this changed my perspective on things after it happened, and I've never been able to forget it. I was going through the cut through, just minding my own business, and then I heard a blood-curdling growl. I just froze. I was so scared, and then I turned around and I couldn't believe what I saw. This thing that I was looking at was about 7 feet tall, with a heavy build and black fur all over its body. I'm 6'8", and I am scared of no man, but this thing scared the living shit out of me. I started to back up bit by bit, and it just stood there and looked at me. And then it started to come towards me, and I ran like mad. I don't think I have ever ran that fast in my life before. I knew it was behind me all the way. I could hear it breathing and running. How I managed to get home, I will never know. But somehow I did. I came flying through the front door, as I was as white as a ghost. My dad asked me what happened, and when I told him, he said, "Oh, it's just the dark playing tricks on your eyes." After about a week or so of him keep saying this, I thought he was right, so I left it at that. I was so wrong, though. A year or so later, I was walking over the place with my girlfriend's brother. It was a foggy night, we were just walking along, and then, just out of the blue, he said, "What's that?" I couldn't see anything. I said, "What are you on about?" And he pointed in the fog at this crouch thing. I could not believe my eyes. It was moving through the fog swiftly, and then it stopped. And that's when I heard that growl again, and we both set off running. We ran like mad. I couldn't believe it. I can't believe that I saw it. And I had convinced myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. But I couldn't do that the second time. How do I explain this away? Who can explain it to me? As it feels like no one can. I believe what I saw ever since that night. I've never walked that way again. And we have never talked about it, even to the lad I was with. Not even when I see him now. We never have a conversation about it. And I still think about those nights to this day, Deborah. It still scares me that much. I'm not nuts, and I know no one will believe me, but I saw a werewolf, and I will take a lie detector test if you could arrange it to prove that I'm not lying. The creature that I saw was crouched over on all fours, and it was still huge, at least 5 feet high, and it had stood up to its full height. I think it would have been about 7 foot tall. It was very broad across the chest, and the width, it was bigger than mine, and I've got a 50-inch chest. It was massive, and all black in colour, longish arms, had very dark hair, and it was covered everywhere, but I'm sure it had a dog's head. I do remember its eyes. I will never forget them, or the colour of them. They were yellowish. And to be honest, I was so terrified, I don't think I'll ever forget that night. I would love to arrange a lie detector test for him. I do a lie detector test myself, but I honestly believe that even if we did, people still wouldn't believe what we saw. It stays with you, and it stays with you forever. You don't put the time in that I put in to something that didn't happen. I mean, just this week alone, I was contacted by another lady who lives near Bewley, where I had my experience. It has all of the same things going on as here, who saw something at her grandmother's home. And she said, my grandmother's roaming it. And she said to me, it can't touch you and it can't hurt you. And I cannot imagine just how scared he must have been. It had to have been terrifying for him. I also have a report from a couple who saw something watching them from the woodlands in a similar area in September of 2020. They felt that whatever it was hiding in the shrubs, and it was following them throughout the woodland. Earlier, I talked about the Heckstone and that the area was riddled with natural cave systems and tunnels. One of those systems pops up in Greasley, an area in woodland known locally as Snakewood. I received a report many years ago from a man who saw a family of strange hairy creatures on more than one occasion when he was with friends. And he said, there's a place I know called Snakewood, and it's part of the original Sherwood Forest, but due to the industrialisation of the Midlands, it's become a secluded woodland area that runs for at least 20 miles, and it's fenced off with deer that roam throughout. It's now a nature reserve. I used to camp down there many years ago as a teenager growing up. We'd stay overnight often, and we'd hear screeching noises that were not birds or any type of wildlife or any foxes. Our camp was ransacked one night as we lay in our tents. We were zipped up. All of our food was taken. My friend caught sight of what he described as a huge, hairy man with no clothes on. I never saw the figure at that time, but it changed my friend's life. He would often tell us over and over again about it for years, and we would joke about it to him. He used to go back on his own, sit for hours. Once he came back and kept telling us there was a family of 3 things living down there. The youngest being he described as a child ape-like creature which ran on its hind legs. We thought it was nuts. He took us back there some 30 years later and showed us where they could be seen from the top of a disused railway line embankment that overlooked the part of the woods where an old clay pond had formed. From our vantage point, we were around half a mile away from the wood. We sat there all afternoon drinking beers until we heard the same screech that we'd heard as young teenagers. Even now, I'm lost for words at what we saw. As we were sitting there, this huge, chestnut-coloured hairy man thing emerged from the clearing towards the pond, and I watched it with 2 of my mates as it was bathing itself for over half an hour. We were lost for words. The only thing my mate could say was, I told you. I told you. He still goes to those woods in winter time, and he leaves food out for them. He told us he's seen the branches that you show in your videos. He says they're waypoint markers, and when one passes by, they'll turn it towards the direction that they're going, so others know which way they've gone. I came across your channel by accident, and I was stunned when I started watching it. Even now at my age, I'm over 50, I find it hard to believe. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would never have believed that they exist. I can categorically state that they are real and they do exist. To be honest, myself and my other friends ragged my mate for over 35 years about this. It's just not something I would have believed prior to seeing them. My friend was always adamant from the beginning as to what he witnessed all those years ago, and he never let it go. He would often sporadically call in to see me in passing, as my house is just adjacent to those woods, and he'd tell me that he'd been back there leaving food for him. I can't tell you how many times I've rolled my eyes and laughed at him, but after seeing it for myself, the whole saga was pretty emotional. There was an old wives' tale that circulated around the estate and was told to young children who stayed out longer than they should have, that if you went into the woods at night, you'd never be seen again. I'm not sure if it was related or if other people have seen them, but it all adds to the mystery. There are people that frequent Snakewood with cameras and clipboards at certain intervals throughout the year, but I'm not sure if that's related either, as it's a nature reserve. The canopy of trees is extremely dense, and even on the brightest of days it looks dark in there. All I can tell you is that I know what I saw that day on the railway embankment, and even now, it blows my mind just thinking about it. Now, these are not the only reports in Nottingham. There are a multitude more. There are big cat reports, UFO reports, paranormal reports. There's a report from Loscar Wood that was also part of Sherwood Forest, where a gentleman who'd been fishing for the day was leaving at night and caught a 7-foot humanoid creature in the car headlights on his car. There's a lady who was driving home from work going through Sherwood Forest, and she saw at the side of the road what she described as a father and son wild man or caveman type figure. There have been reports of whoops, pooping, hollering, screams. The amount of audio reports for the Sherwood area is off the charts, really. I think some of them are people who don't visit the forest often and they're caught out by, barn owls, foxes, that kind of thing. But there is a core group there of people who wild camp and live in the area who report sounds that they cannot identify. We've had BBR investigators in the area for at least 12, 14 years now, and there is a multitude of evidence finds that comes from there. It's also a place with cave systems. The forest used to be far bigger, as most of them, like Delamere and, the New Forest, Forest of Dean, those kind of areas, far bigger than they are now. But maybe that's why we see them, because we've left them so little land to live in, if that makes sense. And if they are connected to the ground and to do with energy, maybe there's something about that area. So as you can see, Nottingham isn't just known for its tales of Robin Hood. There are some strange experiences being reported in the area. One local newspaper stated, exclusive figures released by Nottinghamshire Police have revealed that in the last 2 years, there have been 11 sightings of ghosts reported to the police, a staggering 87 reports of witchcraft, the numbers which were obtained by a Freedom of Information request. And it says that was the amount of times police were called out to UFOs, paranormal activity, ghost reports, and witches. Witches by far were the most frequently reported, with 222 accounts. There were 5 reports of paranormal activity, 6 of UFOs, and 36 of ghosts. No doubt going forward, these figures will climb still higher. A little bit of a treat for you tonight. I mentioned earlier Beulah where I had my experience. Now, Wollerton Hall is a very similar setup. And you've often heard me do podcasts where I speak about an old family estate that's kind of been taken over by the corporation and people now visit as a nature reserve. We seem to get these very strange creature reports that are seen on them. So I've been in The Guardian lately, and they were showcasing my work as a monster hunter, as they titled it. And a lady who comes from my hometown got in touch with me. And she's had an experience as when she was a small child. I don't know her, don't know her family, don't know anything about her. And she said that I validated something that had happened to her. So I'm going to read it to you raw. I've not done any work on it. Came in about 3 hours ago. And I thought, as I'm doing the podcast today, I'll give it as a little treat. In my hometown, there are many different kinds of people. It's a port town, it's an inland port, and lots of people have settled there over the years and over the decades and over the centuries, to be honest. Some of my family were actually travellers that lived on the barge, coal barges on my dad's side. Mum's side were travellers and Romany. And a lady got in touch with me who's also from the Romany community, and she said, I've just read a post about your experience that happened when you were younger at Beulah Park, and it's piqued my curiosity because I grew up visiting my grandparents very close to there in Athol Street, and something terrible happened to that land that their home sat on, and I saw it. And my grandmother, being born from spiritual Romany, just put her arm around me and told me it couldn't touch me or anyone else in that house. And I contacted her back and I said, oh, thank you so much for getting in touch. I knew where she was talking about. I know Athol Street. There's a park there now, if you look on Google Earth, I think it's called Clarendon Park now. Well, back when I was a child, it was called Chimney Pot Park. And if from street level, you wouldn't know it was a park because it's an old brick reservoir that sat where they pulled a lot of coal out previously, 1800s, that kind of thing. And I've always believed that it was the damaging of that land and the damaging of the land at Beulah that conjured up something that disturbed the land in some way. And she was explaining to me that her grandparents lived in those homes. Now, some of the terraces are still there, but Salford was heavily bombed during the war, as it was a port town, and we had the gasworks there as well. So some of the terraced houses were knocked down and new houses were built on them. But the original streets were like miners' cottages, and they were for the mill workers and people that worked at the docks. Just your normal 2 up, 2 downs. And her grandmother lived in one of them. And she said, you'd go in the front door, and the front door used to open directly into the living room. You'd have a set of stairs that run up, and the back kitchen, because back in the day when they were built, there was no bathroom inside or toilets inside. There's like a huge back kitchen where you lived, and most people, my family included, that parlour room, you never went in. The front room, regardless of how small the house was and how many people lived in it, Mrs. Green had 16 boys and her 2 up, 2 down. Nobody used that parlour room, and that's what it was like. And she said, do you know the stairs, Dad, between the kitchen and the living room? And you'd walk up halfway and then you'd turn to go up the next flight. She said, so from the bottom of the stairs, you couldn't see the top. And she's right, they're dead narrow and twisted. And some people even went into the loft or the attic, as the family got bigger and bigger. And she said, I was terrified of them stairs. And then I saw the reason for my fear. And I think she's been picking up on something when she'd been little, when she says she's terrified. Do you remember the case not too far away in Salford where the lady saw a silhouette of a devil on the wall? We're talking about the same kind of house. And she said, I saw something very tall, maybe 7 foot, black fur, and it had a pointed face. I'd been asked if it resembled a werewolf, but no, this was something far more hideous. It was intelligent. I remember my grandma putting her arm around me and it moving away from her slowly, not moving its eyes from me, and it never looked directly at me grandma. I always felt its presence, but none of my cousins seemed bothered about being in there. They used to use the upstairs happily. I wouldn't. I always used the back one. My gran told me it would never do anything. And apart from feeling it at times and seeing it, nothing never really happened to me. She said, and I felt that it was my nana that had protected me about that. Now, she's gone on and explained some other experiences to me, and I'll bring you to them later on. But I thought that was really interesting. So many of the reports that I've brought to you recently that have come in from ordinary people all across the UK happened in these stately home type areas. Now, it could just be a flying coincidence because that's where we spend our leisure time when you're in, the small villages and you live in the towns. But I don't think it's that. I think it's more than that. They all seem to have a connection to the land somehow, and land that's been disturbed over time. So I think there's a number of clues come up. So I'd like to thank Ole for being the subject of our podcast tonight. It takes me a while sometimes to decide what I'm going to bring to you guys because I think I'm going to make it interesting for you. I don't want to just sit here and lecture and things like that. And I'd like to do a bit more of that going forward. So, as some of the reports weren't mine tonight, I have added the links to them directly so you can go over to the blog yourself and have a read of them. And I'd encourage you to just do a Google search of your own areas where you live for anything paranormal. I usually put I put Horwich paranormal activity or Horwich UFO, something like that, and it'll pop up. It'll tell you what's out there. And I never normally you'll get a few on the first bit of Google. Go right back as far as you can, page 16, page 17, get in them forums, and you'll find, as I was talking about tonight, you'll have paranormal forums where people are talking about 7 foot tall ape like creatures. And you'll have cryptid forums where people are describing reptilians. Because unless you have a knowledge or a background in a particular subject, you don't know what to report it as. In Bournemouth, there are 3 different reports, all by different people, all of the same thing. One report is to a cryptid site, one report is to a paranormal site, and one report is to a UFO site. Because each witness had a background in those subjects. So are we seeing these creatures in a way that we would recognise? But that's a whole other podcast. So until next week, thank you so much for joining me. I'll be back on the same day at the same time. Good night, everyone.